Oh, good afternoon, everyone. This is Peter Larson here with another interesting webinar for the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine. We're going to be talking today with Professor Yakof Rabkin, who's Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Montreal. Professor Rabkin, welcome.
My pleasure.
And as we discussed beforehand, you're okay if I call you Yakov, and so I'm going to do that for the rest of the conversation.
We'll save time this way.
People who have been on other OFIP webinars know our general protocol. I start off with a land acknowledgement. We broadcast from Ottawa on unceded Indigenous territory, in recognition of which an OFIP board member makes an annual contribution to INSPIRE, which is an Indigenous organization promoting education for Indigenous youth. I will, in a second, spend a few minutes introducing Professor Rabkin. I will then, after that, interview him for 20 minutes or so, maybe half an hour, depending on how the conversation goes, and then open the floor up to discussion for anybody from the floor who can either raise questions or raise objections. If you want to do so, that's perfectly fine. I suggest you use the Q&A function, which is down at the bottom of your screen. Or you can raise your hand, and I'll ask in the background. My colleague Grafton Ross is keeping an eye on questions and keeping an eye on people raising their hands. So please, I hope Grafton will flag for me if I don't notice a raised hand, in which case you can ask a question or make a comment directly with Professor Rabkin. We will wind up at about 3 o'clock, so about an hour. So the topic today is on the link between Israel's war on Iran and the question of Palestine. And when I woke up this morning at 7 o'clock on the CBC News announced that in Tehran, one of the big squares, there was a huge demonstration in favor of Palestine, which that's sort of interesting. And I had not paid attention and not remembered the fact that today is Al-Quds Day. Al-Quds Day was declared by the revolutionary government in Iran after the Shah was expelled. And it's, as I understand it, the last day of Ramadan, last Friday, I guess, of Ramadan, that Iran has declared Al-Quds Day. And there are Al-Quds Day demonstrations around the world. So it could not be more appropriate to be having this topic while there are demonstrations in Tehran Square. And you could actually hear bombs going on of some sort in the background while they were doing it. There's a tiny postscript to that. That was on the 7 o'clock news. On the 8 o'clock news, they had the same sounds, but they said it was a pro-regime demonstration, and Palestine was not mentioned by CBC in their reporting in the 8 o'clock news. Our guest today is Professor Yakof Rabkin, who I said is Professor Emeritus at the University of Montreal. I'm thrilled he's been able to fit us into his busy schedule. He is a writer and is often asked to appear on webinars around the world. He is a historian and a public intellectual. He has published on politics, religion, the history of science and technology. His works on the history of Judaism, Zionism, and Israel, published in many languages, have been especially well known. He has been a professor of history at the University of Montreal in Canada since 1973. He is a graduate of Leningrad University, and he completed postgraduate studies in the history of science at the USSR Academy of Sciences in Moscow. I'm going to come back on that with him in a second. One of his most recent books is called Israel and Palestine, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. In fact, I contacted Professor Rabkin about 4 or 5 months ago when I read the book, and I said, I've been working in this field for a long time, but I learned a lot in reading the book, and I wanted to know if he would do a webinar with me just on the first couple of chapters, which I thought were terrifically insightful. We agreed to do so, but then other things intervened. And then I saw most recently an article by him in Canadian Dimension magazine on the link between the war in Iran and the Palestinian issue. And that jumped up at me right away because I am painfully aware, as many on this call will be, that since the war, the last couple of weeks, since the U.S.-Israeli attack on Iran has come up, Palestine has almost completely disappeared from public conversation. So I was really looking for an opportunity to discuss the link between the two. Before we get directly into the subject at hand, I would like to ask Dr. Rabkin, or Yakov, to tell me a little bit about your personal history. I don't think I've ever had the opportunity to speak to someone before who was a graduate of the University of Leningrad or who was with the at the Soviet Union Academy of Social Sciences. I got that correct? Anyway, can you tell us a little bit? Do you mind sharing with us a little bit your history? How you came from Leningrad to be a well-known Canadian public intellectual in Montreal?
Well, I was born in 1945 in Leningrad just after the end of the Second World War. And it was quite natural that I went to the University of Leningrad and then continued my studies in Moscow. I always cherished freedom, and that's why I emigrated in 1973. And I was lucky that the Université de Montréal was looking at that time for a historian of science who could speak French, and I filled those two requirements. So I was hired by the Université de Montréal, and that's how I landed here in November 1973. And I've been here since. So my initial work concerned history of science, science policy studies. Then I would say about 30 years ago, I became interested in issues of culture and science, and that's how I began doing work on Jews in science, because Jews were very disproportionately present in the elite science in the 20th century. And I asked myself, what exactly is the case and how it works? So I've published a few things about that, and that's how I got into contemporary Jewish history and later to studies of Zionism and Judaism. So that's pretty much my itinerary.
Very, very interesting. Were you very religiously Jewish or ethnically Jewish? Help us decode that a little bit.
In the Soviet Union, just like in Israel, Jewish is a nationality. It's not a confession, it's not a religion. And therefore, it was written in my identity card that I was Jewish, just like it was written among my friends that they were Russian, Armenian, or Uzbek, whatever.
Inside the Soviet Union.
Inside the Soviet Union, it was a recognized nationality, and we can get back to it because there was pretty much the same idea that was transferred to Palestine, and that's very important for Zionism, for the emergence of Zionism. The Judaism is a nationality, not a confession. So I didn't know practically anything about Judaism or Jewish history when I grew up in the Soviet Union. It was only in Montreal, say 2-3 years after I landed here, that I started asking myself certain questions about what it means to be Jewish, because it was no longer written in my identity card, which doesn't exist except the driving license. So I started reading up on Jewish history, and that's how I acquired some understanding of the evolution of Jewish life. And at the same time, I became interested in more spiritual aspects of Judaism, so I became observant, and I've been observant ever since.
Thanks for sharing that with us. Thank you very much. So let's turn to the subject at hand, which is the link between the Israel-American war on Iran and the question of Palestine. As I said, those of us who've been concerned with Palestine for some time have been frustrated that this issue has been shoved off to the side. And we all feel there is some kind of vague link, but it's not really very clear to us. And maybe you can help us. Explain to us the main thesis that you were putting forward in that article in Canadian Dimension.
Well, the connection is direct. People should ask themselves, why is there hostility of the Islamic Republic towards what they call the Zionist entity? And why Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic, even quoted some Persian poetry that the Zionist regime should disappear from the page of history, which was, of course, misinterpreted and mistranslated as a threat to the physical extermination of Jews in Israel, which it was.
Was that purposely done? Or was that?
That was a while ago, particularly when President Ahmadinejad repeated that. He quoted that sentence. And of course, he was accused of threatening the Holocaust, of extermination and all that. And I remember answering on the pages of Jerusalem Post. And the title of my article was "The Problem is Zionism." And the problem has remained Zionism. In other words, the hostility of the Islamic Republic is not to the people of Israel, but to the Zionist regime, which is the official ideology and which structures the Israeli society and the Israeli state. In other words, it's particularly in 2018, there was a new nation-state law that was adopted by the Israeli parliament, which stipulates that the state of Israel is the state of the Jewish people. Well, Jewish people, again, now I'm going back to my personal history. See, in order to be a people, you have to be some kind of a nation or a nationality. And that idea is not natural. It was definitely not natural 100 years ago, 120 years ago, when Zionism was being shaped. And that's why Zionism was originally rejected by the vast majority of Jews. And I'm making a short excursion in history. That's professional deformation. I always do that. Around Europe and North America, the idea of Zionism was utterly ignored or rejected. The place where
among Jews.
Yeah, among Jews.
Yeah.
No, because the idea of Zionism, essentially from the beginning, the 17th century, is a Christian Protestant idea that made its way to Britain, from Britain to the United States, and then it developed in the 19th century as a conjunction of sort of religious desire to speed the second coming of Christ and the geopolitical interest of the British Empire. So that's how it became so prominent among Christians. Jews joined this idea by the very end of the 19th century, and they were largely intellectuals, German-speaking intellectuals in Vienna, in Germany, who were quite estranged from Judaism, but they felt frustrated by anti-Semitism, and in fact, they had a first Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897, because in Munich, where they wanted to have the Congress, the German Jewish community refused and asked the government to forbid it. Now, just give you an idea.
So the German Jewish community in Munich was hostile enough to the idea of Zionism that they didn't want the Congress to be held there.
Right.
What was the basis? Why were they opposed to it?
Oh, because it was a perversion of Judaism. And also, it was very similar to the anti-Semites' idea that Jews don't belong to Germany. You see, that's why Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism, wrote in his diary that anti-Semites will be our best allies and friends.
Because they would be in favor of expelling the Jews, forcing the Jews out of Germany and go somewhere else.
Because they consider Jews to be a foreign element. And that's what Zionists do as well. So,
sorry, I interrupted you. You were in full flight there.
No, I was coughing. Going back to what we were saying, the Iranian Islamic Republic was opposed to the dispossession, expulsion, and now genocide of Palestinians. And that's the source of their hostility. They have been supporters of the resistance be it Hamas or Hezbollah. So they, unlike many Arab countries or Turkey, don't only denounce Zionism, they actually do something about it. And that's how they became the enemy number one for Israel. So this explains the current war.
So you see it not so much in the Greater Israel Project, which is to take over some people hold to take over the land from the Nile to the Euphrates. This is not part of that. This is not motivated by that, as you said, or am I wrong?
Well, the last time I looked at the map, Iran was quite a bit east of Euphrates. So no, I think it is part of the plan that was published. It's not a conspiracy theory. Clean break, securing the realm for Israel, which was published in 1996. Or Israel Firsters, Richard Pearl, Douglas Feith, and I think David Wurmser, among three prominent neocons in the United States, who authored this report, which pretty much outlines what the United States would do, and it has done. What you see is the attack on Iraq, the dismemberment of Libya, what happened in Syria, in Sudan. So all of these things, in other words, for the idea of the report was to weaken or preferably fragment states around Israel so that Israel will remain the sole power. And that is pretty much the case. It has succeeded. And one problem with this was it has been Iran, which, unlike Arab states, did not submit themselves to the American diktat, and that's the source of this war. So it is whatever other pretexts, change of regime or nuclear weapons, which is just as a hoax as it was for Saddam Hussein. Actually, they can't invent anything new. It's always the same story. I mean, it's amazing. And even, so that's the connection, a direct connection between the Palestinian issue and the current war.
And so in each case, this is the Chomsky's manufacturing consent. They manufacture reasons where they must get rid of Gaddafi in Libya, or they must get rid of Saddam Hussein, or they must get rid of the Assads in Syria or whatever. And now they must get rid of the Khomeini in Iran.
Yeah, well, the narrative in those cases was a little bit better focused than it is now, because Trump's reasons for the war were all around. I mean, the bomb, the regime change, the freeing of women, whatever. He couldn't focus too well, and the narrative has been very shaky. That's why the vast majority of Americans oppose this war from the very beginning, which is very uncommon, because in the case of war on Iraq, 75% supported the United States action, even though it was just as unfounded. It was just as unprovoked. And incidentally, the word unprovoked hasn't been used by mainstream media in this case. Perhaps they don't want to confuse the picture, because I remember using it very, very frequently about some other military action.
Right. Prior to coming on, we shared some information. I know that you have been to Iran on at least one occasion. I have too, and I'd like to just explore a little bit. I think in everybody's mind, or in the mind of most Canadians, maybe probably not most Canadians on this call, but most Canadians, there is this lingering fear that Iran is actually, or its leadership is actually motivated by a deep well of anti-Semitism, that they would like to kill all Jews in the world and so on. Maybe, I know you've written a bit about this. Would you share a little bit your experience? Have you been to Iran more than once or just on one occasion?
No, it's only once, and your participants can Google Rabkin Iran Jews, and they'll have my little travelogue, which I published. Um, well, first of all, in Iran, Jews are not considered a nationality. It's considered a confession, just like it is in Canada, just like it is elsewhere. And when I arrived there, I was pleasantly surprised that unlike many European countries, and now in Canada as well, there were no guards at the entrance to the synagogue.
There were no guards at the entrance synagogue.
It was just open.
Yeah, and that was my experience too. I walked in, and in fact, at the main synagogue in Tehran, I met the caretaker who was Muslim, and everybody seemed to be quite copacetic with that.
I was totally relaxed. And so now we have to understand that Jews have been in what is today Iran for almost 3,000 years. So they are Iranians of Judaic confession, if you like. And they're perceived as such. Because the emergence of Jewish nationality in the Russian Empire was directly linked with the discrimination of Jews in the Russian Empire and the Pale of Settlement and all that. In Iran, they didn't have this, and that's why Jews evolved more or less naturally. Now, the accusations of anti-Semitism, well, they are historically unfounded, even though there were religiously motivated cases of violence in the history of Iran. That's definitely true, but nothing comparable of what Jews experienced in Europe, because in Europe it was a much more violent and anti-Jewish history. In Iran, there were cases, but they were relatively few. So I hope I answered your question.
Sure.
As to the idea that Iran is about to kill Jews around the world, well, I have nothing to say about it. It's ridiculous.
And how do you? My sense is that the Jewish community in Canada has become quite convinced of that thesis. Someone is convincing them or telling them that Iran is basically motivated by a desire to wipe out Jews.
Well, it has to do with in some Jewish communities, including Canadian, the Jewish identity became structured around two poles. One, the memory of Holocaust, and the second, the support for the state of Israel. And you see that issue can be easily conjugated with both.
Mm.
But I would like to remind you and the listeners that Canada broke relations with Iran under Harper. And I remember the day when it so happened, my daughter picked me up at the university and says, "Did you hear in Iran, they forced Jews to wear yellow stars?" I said, "Well, it's impossible. Come on. Where did you hear it?" So I heard it on CBC. Well, sure enough, National Post published an article about it. I think the following day, they published a rebuttal saying that they were mistaken. However, the first news is what remained in the memory. And the Canadian government broke relations with Iran. So there are so many cases of manipulation that lead not only to political problems like breaking relations, but to real bloodshed that is happening today.
Mm. Mm. Just as we continue on here, I flagged for people, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A on the bottom of your screen. My colleague, Grafton Ross, is behind the scenes. He'll be curating the questions and pitching them to Yakov in a few minutes. Or alternately, raise your hand. You click on raise hand, and I'll try to keep an eye on what hands are raised, and I would be glad to have you pose your questions or make comments, or for that matter, object or disagree. I'm sure the professor is happy to deal with people who have other substantive arguments. So thank you. Let me just stretch the patch a little bit more broadly. I did invite you to talk about the link between Iran and the Palestinians. But more recently, there's been the involvement, involvement of Hezbollah and a ferocious attack that Israel has made on Lebanon, expelling several 100,000 people in the south of Lebanon, and now bombing. Is this a different issue, or is this the same impetus, Professor?
Well, all the violence around Israel and by Israel is linked with the Palestinian issue. The war that Israel won, and Israel calls it independence war, in 1948, was caused by expulsion of Palestinians from their homes. That's why Arab countries attacked the new state of Israel. And except perhaps the war of 1956, which was a purely imperialist adventure with the British and the French to conquer the Suez Canal. Every other war, I think, has to do with the Palestinian issue, because the Arab countries at that time, Nasser and others, wanted to help their brethren recover the territory, or at least receive equal treatment in the territory of Palestine. Israel, on its part, wanted to protect the Zionist apartheid system. And in 1967, more Palestinians were expelled from the territory that Israel occupied. And then, if you look, most of the violence connected with Hezbollah or Hamas, or before that with the PLO, is connected with the Palestinian issue, nothing else. It's not an issue of anti-Semitism, that they imbibed hatred of Jews with the milk of their mothers. You know, if the Swiss decided to occupy Palestine, the reaction of the Palestinians would have been exactly the same. So we have to realize that reaction to occupation and dispossession and to genocide is pretty hostile and universal everywhere. So it's not an exceptional case. What is exceptional, of course, is the importance that the State of Israel has acquired in the world, thanks to its scientific and technological success, its arms manufacturing and testing and sales of arms as a result, and now surveillance and control technologies connected with the AI and very, very advanced methods of controlling population. So Israel has become very useful to many countries who cooperate with Israel, whatever their rhetoric in defense of Palestinians.
And how then, since we're on that, Iran has been, for some reason, the standout amongst Muslim countries. Most of the Arab countries have, to one degree or another, capitulated. They're maybe rhetorically supporting the Palestinians, but in fact, some of them joined the Abraham Accords, and others have commercial dealings with, including Turkey and Egypt and so on. So what makes Iran different? Why is Iran kind of the standout amongst the neighboring Muslim countries?
Well, I really don't know. I cannot tell. Not being a specialist on Iran, right. I can just mention that most of the Arab countries and Turkey are majority Sunni, and perhaps they have a different attitude towards the concept of justice and solidarity. But I really cannot properly answer this question, and that's why I don't want to mislead your audience.
Okay, fine. I'll just turn, it's now 2:30, so I'll just see. Grafton, do we have some questions in the Q&A?
Yes, we do. The first question has to do with the motivations of the British Mandate government. As you know, of course, the mandate was to the mandate imposed on Great Britain was to provide for self-determination in Palestine, but that never happened. So what do you suppose Britain's real motivations were? Did they intend to keep it for themselves? What was their plan?
Well, the British acted, there were several stages in the British attitude towards Palestine. It should be noted that the Balfour Declaration, when it was issued in 1917, has two interesting traits. One, the British supported the Jewish homeland in Palestine before they occupied Palestine. In other words, it was still Ottoman territory when they did this. Second, perhaps even more important, the only Jewish member of the British cabinet at that time, Montagu, vigorously protested against the Balfour Declaration, accusing the British government of anti-Semitism. Supporting Zionism, he wrote, is a sign of anti-Semitism. So that's 1917. Then another stage is, of course, the...
Ryan, just develop that. What was his thinking there? Just make sure everybody's clear. Why was the Balfour Declaration, in his view, a sign of anti-Semitism?
Because it considers Jews to be an alien element in Britain. He said, if we are going to have states for every religion, it'll be quite a mess. The letter by Montagu is available online. Anyone can access it and read it. It's quite an interesting, it's not long, it's a couple of pages. So that's 1917. Now then, the League of Nations gave Britain the mandate to lead Palestine to independence, eventually, which Britain didn't do. And one of the reasons it didn't do, that every attempt it made in the 30s to convene some kind of an assembly of quasi-parliament in Palestine was vigorously opposed by the Zionists because they were in a minority, and any parliament would immediately kill the idea of a Jewish state because they were a minority till the expulsion of Palestinians in 1948. So this idea was quietly set aside. And as you know, during the Second World War, millions of European Jews were slaughtered by the Nazis. So the population that potentially could go to Palestine was no longer there. That's one of the reasons, I think, why Israel was established, is that there was a very justified sympathy for the Jews who were one of the major victims of the Nazis. And so in 1948, the United Nations, or 1947, it was the 29th of November 1947, the United Nations voted, the General Assembly, that Palestine should be divided into two states, a Palestinian Arab state and a Jewish state. And this is a very important date for Israelis. In many places, like Jerusalem, there's a street of 29th of November commemorating that. So for Britain, and Britain essentially left Palestine in 1948. Again, there was some kind of an alliance in 1956 with Britain to attack Egypt. So Britain betrayed its mandate, but I'm afraid that's not the only case of betrayal in British foreign relations.
British history. You mentioned there's a 28th of November street in Jerusalem. There are also, as you know, Balfour streets in most most Israeli towns as well. He's almost like a saint. He's a hero in Israel.
Yeah, actually, he was an anti-Semite, incidentally. He was Christian Zionist and anti-Semite because he was opposed to immigration of Russian Jews to Britain in 1905-06. There was an Alien Act. I mean, it's all documented. So it's not just the idea of Herzl that they'll be our friends. They have been.
So he preferred that they go to Palestine rather than come to Britain. That was basically it.
Of course. And in fact, anti-Semites, this common slogan of anti-Semites at that time was, go to Palestine. You know, it was an insult.
Mm.
Go to Palestine.
Grafton, have you got another question there?
Yes, Professor, could you speak a little bit more about the Jewish community in Iran? Did a lot of Jews leave Iran after the creation of the State of Israel? Like a number of Jews left Iraq and Syria and Morocco and many places for Israel. Was that the case in Iran as well?
To a lesser degree. To a lesser degree. And as far as I know, again, I'm not a specialist in Iran, there were not cases of simulated violence against Jews. By simulated violence, I mean what happened in Iraq when bombs were planted by Zionist agents to make Jews feel insecure and therefore speed up their emigration. The same thing was in Morocco. In Iran, as far as I know, it didn't happen. And actually, quite a few Jews remained in Iran after the Islamic Revolution as well. There is an interesting consequence of the Islamic Revolution for, I would say, Jewish identity in Iran. You know, Iranian Jews were very modernized, and many of them were in professions and so on. And as it happened in Europe as well, the knowledge of Judaism and the practice of Judaism was somewhat weakening. Then comes the Islamic Revolution. Religious education is obligatory. Every Jewish child has to go and study with a rabbi. As a result, you now have, when I was there,
The rabbi. So yeah. It wasn't Muslim education. It was the very
no. Well, it was religious. I said religious education. So if you're a Jew, you would be studying with a rabbi or Jewish teacher, whatever. If you're a Muslim, you would be taught Muslim Islam. So the studying of Judaism became obligatory. And as a result, you have a very interesting mix of very modern community in Iran and quite a high degree of observance, because in Tehran, there were 4 kosher restaurants when I was there. That's a good indication of what's going on. I think we have about 4 or 5 in Montreal for 100,000 Jews, and there were 4 for 3 or 4,000 Jews. And I don't know how many in Tehran, but definitely less than 100,000. And just another episode which I observed, and I arrived in Shiraz, which is a big city there. And in the morning I arrived and my bus was late, and someone who met me, a Jewish graduate student, it was about 9 in the morning. I said, well, sorry, I missed morning prayers because it must be late. Oh, no, he said, we Jews in Shiraz are very lazy. There will be a last service at 9:30. I'll take you there. Which 5 services of morning prayers is highly unusual. Perhaps in New York you would have it, or in Jerusalem, but I saw that in Shiraz.
So make sure I'm decoding that. It means that they had several different services, reflecting the fact that there are lots of people.
Yeah, it means that they have to accommodate people who go to work at different time.
Right.
It's as far as I know, it's a very rare occurrence. And they do observe, all the while being very modern, because some of them at that time were in commercial activities. And I saw on Shabbat, when I walked the street, half of the stores were closed.
Interesting. I do remember when I was there, I went to the synagogue in Tehran, and they were preparing for something, and I could. I asked. It was some kind of party that night, and I asked if I could come back, and they kind of didn't think that was such a good idea. I later found that it was Yom Kippur, and so as a non-Farsi speaking Goy, it would have been sort of an awkward position. But I got to talk to some people afterwards, so that was fine.
Yeah, well, actually, I was in Iran during Purim and Nowruz, the New Year, and a Muslim friend of mine who was studying Jewish history, she asked me if I could take her to the synagogue. So I asked the people, and they said, "Sure, take her along."
Grafton.
Yes, one of our participants has questions about Hezbollah and Hamas. And do you view armed resistance to Israeli occupation as justified? The Western press tends to portray these groups, Hezbollah and Hamas, as proxies of Iran. Do you consider that positioning to be correct, or do you view them as simply resistance movements that are supported by Iran?
I would think the latter. And as far as I know, the UN Charter considers resistance to occupation legitimate.
Armed resistance.
My opinion is irrelevant here. I'm not a legal scholar, so I can't really say whether it's legal or not. But as far as I know, the United Nations considers it legitimate. And look, most of the struggle against colonialism was armed resistance. People, and in the history of Zionism, the struggle against the British was pretty much terrorist. So this is armed resistance is something which is not only part of history, but part of the understanding in international law that that's a natural reaction to oppression. Well, to the extent that international law exists still, I would refer to the UN Charter rather than to my personal opinion. Now, in the Western media, there are many cliches, and some of them are really misleading. Proxy, they are not doing anything that goes against their interest. You see, proxies usually act on behalf of a distant power that really works against the interests of the warring party because they're doing the will of someone else. But Hamas or Hezbollah are trying to liberate their territory. That's how they try to do it. It doesn't mean that we have to condone everything they do, but the very fact of armed resistance is not something unusual in the history of decolonization.
I see that from the chat. I just took a quick look in the chat. I see that a couple of people have some points where they're in disagreement with you, Dr. Rabkin. I encourage them to raise their hand if they want to speak up and articulate their disagreement, or put it in the Q&A so that we can deal with it. But while that's happening, I'd like to ask you to help me and us with something that I have found awkward. You were very helpful to me 10 years ago when you helped me understand the difference between Judaism and Zionism, and now I understand, I think, better the two streams there. But I still left with a problem, and that is if I meet a Jew who tells me that Zionism is a part of Judaism, I feel that as a non-Jew, I'm not on a very good grounds to say, no, you're wrong. Judaism is something different. There were Christian preachers in the United States who thought that slavery was authorized by the Bible, and there are other Christian preachers who thought it was terrible. And while I agreed with one and disagreed with the other, I was not in a very good position to say you're misinterpreting Christianity. So how should I, as a non-Jew, deal with someone who tells me that my Judaism includes Zionism? Zionism is now an important part of my religion, and that you're being anti-Semitic in contesting that.
Well, there is a lot of polemical vigor around all this because thanks to much of Jewish education, which became Zionist, say about 40 years ago, or 50 years ago, the identity of support for Israel, the identity of Jewish homeland, of a Jewish state, has been inculcated in generations of Jews. And we have to respect that that's part of their Jewish identity. Now, when we talk about Judaism, this is something else. Your Jewish identity, well, any identity can be expressed in different ways. Gastronomical preferences, the books you read, the people you socialize with. So it's all identity without necessarily having a religious dimension to it. Judaism is a religion or a confession, if you like, and a mode of life, and it's a lifestyle too. So commitment to Judaism implies certain obligations. Commitment to Zionism is a political commitment, so it's very different. So commitment to Judaism embraces the way you eat, the way you lead your family life, the way you work, the way you deal in business. So it's a very sort of comprehensive set of obligations. And many people want to be free of those obligations. And there's a particular part of Judaism and of any monotheistic religion, and perhaps even more than monotheistic. Whenever something bad happens to us, we have to first examine our own actions, how they may have led to this calamity, catastrophe, or whatever. So in other words, the first person to ask why this happened is myself. This is so foreign to today's world because we prefer to point at someone else, not only among Jews, but generally. So commitment to Judaism is much more difficult than commitment to Zionism. You don't have to argue with people if their Jewish identity includes Zionism and commitment to Israel and serving in the Israeli armed forces or whatever. It's their right to do so. However, if you disagree or denounce or decry all that, it doesn't make you an anti-Semite. Because anti-Semite, you have to remember what it is. It's hating of Jews because they're Jews. Not because they did something, not because they think something, but because they're foreign, they're alien. It has much to do with the European idea of the purity of the race, and the Jews are contaminating, and so on.
I'm struggling. I hear you, but I'm thinking of this liberal rabbi, liberal in the sense that he preferred LGBTQ and he was in favor of having Syrian refugees come here and so on, but telling me that if you oppose the state of Israel, you're anti-Semitic. And I think he believed it. And I felt bad over that because I don't think I am, but I need to have, and maybe I can't convince him of the contrary. Maybe he's framed it as not a way of dealing with that.
Well, I think the issue is not convincing anyone. You can inform, actually, some liberal denominations in Judaism, like Reconstructionist, are struggling with the issue of Zionism because the majority of students in the Reconstructionist seminary are anti-Zionists. That poses a serious problem. They're future rabbis. But that by and large corresponds to the tendencies among Jews in North America. there's more and more disaffection from Zionism, from the state of Israel, because of the genocide, because of what's happening now as well. So it's not surprising that over 1/3 of the votes that Mamdani, an outspoken critic of Israel and anti-Zionist, received from Jews, over 1/3 of his votes in New York. So many Jews are prominent in the pro-Palestinian movement and so on. Now, if someone accuses you of anti-Semitism, you should not shut up. In other words, this is a way to shut you up.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to be an anti-Semite, so you won't criticize Israel, you won't criticize Zionism. But you should consider it as a method of silencing you. And therefore disregard it. Just disregard. If someone accuses you of something ridiculous that you have never done, well, if someone tells you, you don't speak English properly, you just barely express yourself.
Sure.
You'll dismiss it. You'll just disregard. I say you'll shrug it off.
The challenge is that I can dismiss it because I'm retired. I'm no longer employed. I'm not looking for a job. I don't have a Facebook, Instagram post that. So it becomes very challenging for young people, knowing what they can say and knowing this will be a long tail that follows out after them.
Well, you're raising a very important issue. You're raising the issue of freedom of expression, which used to be sacrosanct south of the border. And also we have a Charter of Rights here that specifies that, stipulates this. I think that support for Israel and for Zionism has been the main factor of undermining freedom of expression, be it at the university campuses or elsewhere.
Well, now you can't even do something that makes people feel uncomfortable, right? It's not a matter of safety anymore. I feel uncomfortable.
Well, I think one of the reasons is that most governments, definitely Canadian government, is very much pro-Israel. And the media follow the government line quite closely. Moreover, media belong to very wealthy people, usually. And within, it's a whole issue. And as you mentioned, young people, if you're a young journalist, why would you touch this subject? It won't help you in promotion. You see what happened in the United States. The Ellison family acquired TikTok, expressed desire to suppress information about Palestine. They acquired CBS, which has already turned, and I think they are about to acquire CNN. So money talks or money silences, both.
Grafton, we've got time for one or two more questions. I don't see any hands raised, so you got the question.
A networking opportunity for you, Dr. Rabkin. One of the participants suggests you get in touch with a Mr. Salim Mansour, who knows much about the culture of the Shia in Iran. So I don't know if you know that person, but
we can send you the link.
Yeah, okay. I could look it up. There's no link provided there. Another asks about the view of the BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions National Committee, their position on the right of oppressed Palestinians to armed resistance. Are you aware of that? Are you in a position to answer that? Or
what's the question?
Does the BDS movement support armed resistance?
As far as I know, BDS is about nonviolent resistance. BDS it's boycott, divestment, and sanctions. None of these three are violent, as far as I know. Not buying Israeli oranges doesn't create violence, as far as I know.
Another participant's asking you to speculate on what would have happened had the Jewish homeland been established in South America or somewhere else. other than Palestine?
Well, it all depends if that territory would display, if that new creation would displace local population or not. You know, if it's really created in some part of Patagonia where there's really no one around, I don't think it would have caused a problem. Moreover, you know, if we are dealing with iffy history, uh, you know, creating a Jewish state in Bavaria in 1948 would cause very little opposition, I think, because the German population would definitely understand why this happened. But the Palestinians have nothing to do with that. They are not responsible for what was done to the Jews during the Second World War, even though, of course, Israel is pushing very hard to almost blame Palestinians for suggesting this idea of genocide to Hitler. Of course, it's totally ridiculous, but Israel never gives up. And I think oppression of Palestinians and the genocide are reasonable grounds for opposition. But I think we are facing now something qualitatively different. Because if the war against Iran doesn't go as Israel planned, and it doesn't seem to so far, a nuclear power in extremis could use nuclear weapons. And that is something that concerns me and should concern a lot of people. And personally, I don't know how and who could prevent it. But at least it's a possibility which is becoming more and more realistic. I hope, very much hope, that I'm wrong.
I think I share, I'm sure many of us on this call share that concern. There's less chance of that happening in Ukraine, where both sides have access to nuclear weapons, but Israel might, if they're losing the battle, might be tempted to use a nuclear weapon, and whatever consequences are not really predictable. It's going to be terrible, but what are the total consequences are unknown.
Ukraine doesn't have nuclear weapons.
No, I mean, okay, with the Americans and the Russians, of course, I agree. I'm going to just move it to an end here. Before I do that, though, I want to just ask you to say a word or two about a couple of books that you have published recently. If I work properly, I should be able to. So here's one book. Tell us what this is about.
Well,
can you see it?
Yeah, I can see it. It was originally published in French, so you can show the cover later. And I put together in 10 chapters, 101 quotes by either Zionists or their opponents or precursors of Zionism, which, in my opinion, explain this phenomenon because many people are puzzled what Zionism is. Joe Biden considers himself a Zionist, and Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn don't. So there is something confusing. I tried to clarify it by putting together in a very short book 101 quotes, okay, with my commentary, obviously.
Perfect.
So I think it should be pretty good for explaining the concept of Zionism.
Did you happen to cover why Prime Minister Carney believes in a Zionist Palestinian state?
No, I didn't use.
He'll have to explain that one.
No, because my book is not meant to be humorous.
Okay. I also have another one here I want to show.
You could show the French. Why don't you show the French original?
Well, because my audience, I'll tell them it's in French, but my audience is predominantly English, so I'm not going to do that now.
Okay, fine.
What's this one about?
Well, What's Modern Israel is a book which I wrote at the express invitation of a Japanese publishing house, which had already published my book on Jewish opposition to Zionism. And it was written for Japanese youth. However, it became quite popular in other languages as well. It explains the origins of Israel, how Jews reacted to Israel, and what Israel has become and what tendencies, what political tendencies we can observe in this. So in case someone wants to read the French original, because I didn't write it in Japanese, I wrote it in French, it's called Comprendre l'État d'Israël.
Je vais aussi mentionner de nouveau autrefois le livre dont j'avais parlé tout à l'heure, this Israel and Palestine, which I found a terrific book, and I recommend it to people who think they already know quite a bit about this issue. I'm sure you'll learn quite a bit more. Israel and Palestine, Jewish rejection of Zionism. It's a tour de force, and I think it's very impressive.
Peter, I am posting some of these links in the chat. So
okay, and I will mention them again in the follow-up email, along with a link to the professor's article on his my holiday in Tehran, or my holiday in Iran from several years ago. With that, I'm going to wind up. I'd like to thank everybody who was on the call today. Thank you for your questions. Grafton Ross, thank you for pitching them to us. My special thanks to Dr. Yakov Rabkin for spending an hour with us, helping to understand the link between this terrible war that's going on in Iran, the war in Iran, the attack on Iran by the United States and Israel, and its linked to the Palestinian question. So, do you have a final word you'd like to say, Yakov?
I think it's very important for people to use their critical facilities and the critical mind. And, you know, I'm speaking from Quebec, and the local alcohol institution, the Société d'Alcool du Québec, has a slogan which I would repeat: consommer avec modération. But I would apply it to Western media. Consommer avec modération.
I think very good advice indeed. The most recent incident of that plane being shot, or American plane crashing, and I couldn't help. Of course, the Americans say it was not done by enemy fire, some other reason. But right away, I thought back to the U-2 incident that you and I, Yakov, are old enough to remember, where the Americans said, no, it was just a weather guy, and he wasn't doing it. And it turns out they had the goods on him, because the pilot they captured and he confessed, and so on and so forth. So I think listening to American news interpretation of the war, beaucoup de modération serait de requise.
No, seriously, because I think that much of the news and interpretation of the news even uses a very biased language. You know, I think you have to be very careful when you see someone saying Iranian regime. You already know where that person stands, because regime is a pejorative term in that kind of rhetoric. And I think what is really lacking in the mainstream media is a much more even-handed treatment of different conflicts, because, well, for example, in La Presse in Montreal, you have very regular, every few months, an editorial by the honorary consul of Ukraine, which I think is very reasonable, because the war is going on for 4 years. But I'm yet to see a similar article by the Russian consul. Mm-hmm. So, because you see, there's no attempt even at even-handed coverage.
Right.
And this has to do with the evolution of media, which is a subject that many other people have discussed, and some really decry the state in which mainstream media find themselves these days.
One that drives me crazy is CBC keeps referring to the fragile ceasefire in Gaza.
Well, ceasefire. Well, I think one of the Palestinians defined it very clear. We seize and they fire.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Rabkin. Thank you, people. And our next, watch out, keep your eye out for our next webinar. We have one we're organizing shortly on comparing settler colonialism in Israel with settler colonialism in Canada. We have an Indigenous person and a Palestinian to help compare the similarities and the differences between the two processes. So thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you.